Hey everyone, in this video we're checking out the Demodash Effects T60 analog modulator. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you're new here, my name is Eric Mero. Here on this channel, you're going to find gear demos like this one and instructional videos aimed to help musicians, just like you and I. So if that sounds cool, please subscribe to the channel, check out all the other videos, and I would love to know what you think of this video and the T60 in the comments below. And as I said in the intro, we are checking out the Demodash Effects T60. Now, at its heart, the T60 analog modulator is a chorus vibrato pedal. So it takes that core concept of being a chorus/vibrato pedal and expands on it in many different ways, giving, the user a lot of flexibility to shape their sound. Before we get into it, let's go over the signal chain real quick. So I'm using my Gibson 70s SG standard. We're going into the T60, and then we're going into the front of this Marshall style, kind of like Super Lead JMP style, like 50 watt amp. It's set really clean. Also, after that, we're going into the aux right here, and that's what you're hearing. The amp is set really clean. We have a few controls that might be familiar to us that we can easily recognize. We have the mix control right up here, which lets us blend between chorus and vibrato. And what that means is that we're blending in more or less wet signal. So here is just with the mix all the way down. And as I turn that mix control up, then we start to hear that chorus effect. When we max out this mix knob, we're turning the T60 from a chorus pedal into a vibrato pedal. Chorus is essentially two signals. We have our dry signal, and then we have a pitch modulated signal going together. So what happens when we take that dry signal away, when we turn the mix all the way up, we're only getting that pitch modulated signal. So now we get vibrato. So next to the mix control, we have the rate control. Now, the rate control is, the most straightforward way on how to change the speed of the chorus. If we turn it all the way down, we get essentially no chorusing action because the LFO, which is used to produce the chorus, the pitch modulation, the LFO is kind of parked. We can kind of hear there's like a little hollow sound a little bit, but as we start to turn that rate up, we're going to take that LFO and make it quicker and quicker. What I want to do real quick before we move on is turn the mix control all the way up so we're hearing only the wet signal, so we can kind of focus in on how that rate controls the wet signal. So here's the fastest rate. In addition to the rate control, we also have tap tempo right here, which we can use to set the speed of our LFO, of our chorus. I'm going to go ahead and put it back down to chorus in the mix control, tap into tempo. We do have an alternate parameter on the rate control, which lets us subdivide the tap tempos. We're going to go over alternate parameters later in the video. So moving on from the rate control, we have the depth control, and that controls how far away your signal is being modulated from your initial pitch. With the depth all the way down, you're not getting any pitch modulation. And as we turn it up, our modulation starts to get more intense and a wider sweep away from your standard pitch. The EQ control lets us shape the sound of either just the wet signal or both our dry and wet signal. How the EQ works is in the middle, we have a nice balance of lows and highs. If we turn the EQ knob below noon, we're starting to roll off high end to emphasize more low end. And if we turn the EQ knob up past noon, we're actually starting to roll off low end to emphasize more high end, maybe get kind of like a more lo-fi sound. Now, in addition to the EQ, how it works, like I mentioned, you can choose to apply this to just the wet signal, which you've been hearing, or we can make it more drastic by choosing to apply the EQ to our dry and wet. How to do that is we hold the Alt foot switch right here, the on-off foot switch, and we just tap the tap tempo. The light then flashes. Red means you're applying the EQ to both your wet and dry signal. So now, in the middle, again, we have a nice balance. But when I start to move that EQ, it's a lot more drastic because it's now affecting the wet and dry signal. And it can be really cool if we turn the mix all the way up so we just have vibrato. So again, that's a really cool feature. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to turn that back to only applying to the wet signal. So again, press and hold the on-off foot switch, tap the tap tempo, we're back into the only wet EQ mode. And now we're gonna go on to the lag control. So the lag controls the internal clock rate on the T60. Now, essentially what that translates to is when we have the lag in the minimum position, that gives the pedal the most power, the most responsiveness. And as we turn it up, we get a more like woozy C6 sound. Our pitch sweep begins to get wider and we get, you know, a more intense chorusing. So let's go ahead, hear the lag at minimum. Now we're going to move on to the chop control. Now at minimum, we have a pretty stable sine wave. As we increase that chop control, it's going to introduce glitchy artifacts and stair stepping of that chorus sound. So our pitch shifting is going to sound a little bit glitchier. So now what I want to do is increase the mix all the way up to maximum. So now we're just getting wet signal, so we can really focus on what that chop's doing to our pitch modulated signal. So now that we've gone over all of the main controls on the T60, I want to tackle some alternate parameters, other ways that the T60 lets us sculpt our sound. Let's go ahead and start with the random control. Now, in order to get to these alternate parameters, we press and hold the Alt foot switch, also the engage foot switch. Press and hold that, and then our controls become the alternate parameters. So while we're pressing and holding the on-off foot switch, the Alt foot switch, our chop control becomes our random control. And at minimum, we get, again, we get that perfect sine wave, that really stable sine wave. And as we turn that random control up, of course, we introduce more random artifacts in that sine wave. So let's go ahead and start at the low end of the random, perfectly stable, and then increase it. And so that's the random control. And now one thing that's really cool is that we can combine that random control, which doesn't make the LFO or the sound really glitchy, It just makes it kind of wobbly, unpredictably and not stable. So we can introduce more glitchiness with that chop control. And then we have an unstable, a random LFO as well as a choppy LFO. And again, one of my favorite things to do is to crank that EQ control to get rid of low end, turn it up to vibrato mode, so we're just getting only the wet signal, so we get a really lo-fi sound. Now Now let's move on to the regen control, which introduces more or less feedback inside the T60 to kind of give you more of like a phaser or flanger sound. How we access the regen control is we press and hold this Alt on-off button, and then our depth control becomes the regen control. At minimum, we don't get any regen, and as we increase the regen control, we're getting more feedback and a more resonant signal inside the T60. So here's with no regen. Now the last thing I want to go over is the ramp function. So what the ramp function does is it takes a selected parameter, either the chop or the rate, and it ramps it to the furthest extreme from where it's set. Let's take the chop for instance. If we're set on the lower side, we press and hold the tap tempo switch to get into the ramp mode to engage the ramp. What that does is it ramps it all the way up to the extreme. Vice versa, if we're up like, you know, past noon somewhere on the chop knob and we engage that ramp, we're gonna ramp all the way down to the minimum. The chop control lets us choose between chop and rate, whichever parameter we want to ramp. Right now we have it set to chop. And now in order to change which parameter we want to ramp, we can press and hold the ramp foot switch and use the chop control. We have some text on the top of the chop that lets us select between rate and chop. Now chop is on the right, so we're going to take that knob and put it over to the left. So now we are ramping the rate control. Let's go ahead and set it slow, and hear the fact that we have now selected the rate control. So when I press and hold this ramp foot switch, it's going to ramp the rate all the way up to the top. And just to demonstrate, if we set the rate up higher and we press and hold that ramp foot switch, it's going to lower it to the minimum. And now the second part of the ramp function is the mode selector. Now we have it on stretch mode, which means we press and hold the ramp foot switch, and as I said before, it takes our rate and it ramps it all the way up and it holds it there. What we can do is press and hold the ramp foot switch, and now our depth control lets us select between stretch, which is what we've heard, and bounce. And in bounce mode, what happens is it goes up to the maximum, the farthest maximum, and then it goes to the other extreme, and then back to the first one. So we will hear, I'll demonstrate. And then the ramp alternate parameter on the rate control lets us control the ramp speed. Now, if we turn it down, we get a slower ramp. So we're gonna take longer to go from our normal signal into that ramp signal. And if we want a faster ramp, again, we can press and hold the tap ramp foot switch and then increase that ramp speed control. And now we have a faster ramp from our normal to our ramp function. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please subscribe to the channel, check out all the other videos, and I would love to know what you think about the T60 in the comments below. If you want to keep up with me on a daily basis, you can always head on over to Instagram. My handle over there is @EricMarrow. And I want to send a gigantic thank you to these folks right over here who are my executive producers. These are my Patreon fam. They help support the channel. They help me keep going. Y'all are the best. Thank you so much. If you would like to learn how to support my efforts here on YouTube, over on Instagram, the podcast, all of my efforts, I will leave a link in the description below. Thank you so much for your support. Thank you for watching. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're staying safe, and I will talk to you in the next video.